Thank you, Amanda, for being here tonight. The Climate Council is always like my trusted source of information when I want to know what does the climate science say today and how should I talk about it. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about climate change. And to start off, why does climate change matter to you personally?
Oh, it's such a good question. I've been asked it so many times, and I think it evolves over time as you learn more about it and as you get more involved. And I think when I started working on climate change, it was a real moment for me when I read Tim Flannery's book, The Weather Makers. I was hiking in the forest in Tasmania in this sort of ancient forest, the Styx Valley, with these enormous trees, and thinking about how, we could change the climate in just a generation. I want to be part of getting ahead of that and preventing these terrible things from happening that I was reading about in the book. But now, that was 2005, so sort of 17 years on, here we are, we're experiencing these impacts. It's still the same motivation, which is essentially to prevent human suffering and to also realize human potential at the same time. Like, I think if we are able to collaborate effectively worldwide to tackle this problem, it almost takes us as a species to the next level. it's that big. It would be an amazing feat of our civilization, and it must be an amazing feat of our civilization to tackle this challenge.
And when you, at the Climate Council, you often talk about this being the critical decade for climate action. Like, we have now this narrow window of opportunity where we still can do things that will improve our lifetime's quality, but also especially the quality of our children. What do you mean with that? Like,
we really try and emphasize the urgency of action this decade. So there's obviously been a lot of talk about achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And that is far too late, but also it shifts the thinking of, okay, this is a future challenge. We need to be getting emissions down in the future. We want to recontextualize and say, this is the decade for action. We need the lion's share of effort to happen now if we're to be on any track to reduce emissions to the scale required. So the scientific analysis that our scientists have done shows, and they're world-class scientists and it's been peer-reviewed internationally, shows that Australia would need to reduce our emissions 75% this decade and then to net zero by 2035. People will say that that's impossible, and it's certainly very difficult to see what the pathway is, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be our aim. It does mean that there is a level of disruption in the change that we're advocating for, because the alternative is massive disruption from climate change. We're already seeing some of that disruption with the Black Summer fires, with the flooding in Australia, and now these enormous heat waves occurring across the Northern Hemisphere. We're in the midst of this climate crisis right now. We either accept a little bit of disruption, and it might be more than a little bit in terms of getting to net zero very rapidly, and then we put ourselves in the best possible scenario to prevent the worst of the climate crisis.
And you're saying we need to aim for 75%, but our current government, it's a step up, but it's not enough. It's aiming for 43% by 2030. What do you think needs to happen and change in Australia to get our government to the point that they will actually fix the problem?
The way I see it is that the federal government will always be a follower. I think it's been very hard for federal governments in the Australian context to lead. And when there has been leadership, we've seen that eroded through scare campaigns and ultimately, Tony Abbott coming to power and taking apart a lot of climate action. So what does it take for a federal government to follow to get 75%? That means that the community has to have gone a long way in terms of what they're clamouring for from the government. It means that business has gone a long way, industry, state governments, local governments. It really pulls into focus all of these other actors in society and makes the work you're doing, for instance, really important in how we tackle the problem. So we can't just be saying, the federal government needs to do this, the federal government needs to do that. Yes, but we need to have laid the groundwork. I often call it an on-ramp for a federal government to then make those commitments.
And what are the opportunities to see for them to in Parliament to create the changes
the
to
first
achieve?
step, I think, is looking at what is the agenda that Labor's laid out, whether it's saying that they'll do an electric vehicle policy or whether it's rewiring the nation. There's a whole range of different policies they came to the election with. And so I think the first step is working with them to say, how strong can these policies be, and demonstrating community support, and then creating what you could call a virtuous cycle. So when a government then introduces certain climate action, that they are celebrated for it. In the past, climate action has been considered something that uses political capital, and Labor comes from the climate wars, if you like, feeling burnt multiple times because they've done things and then they've suffered electorally in their perception as a result. How do we flip that on its head and say every action on climate change, there is this virtuous circle that you get celebrated, then it builds your capacity and your political capital for the next wave of action. So that requires those of us that are in external to Parliament roles to be making sure that we're making the case, we're defending the policies, we are then arguing for them to be stronger, but we're celebrating the successes as they come over the line. And we're tackling the scare campaigns that may well come from certain areas of the press or commentators or the opposition, etc.
And together we open up the window more and more of what's possible by like creating a community that is supportive of climate change.
Absolutely. And I'm in no way saying Labor's perfect. They're certainly, I wouldn't say that they are. And, you know, we've got a long way to go in terms of persuading them on coal and gas, for instance, both in terms of shutting down new projects, how we tackle the export issue, how we tackle phasing out coal and gas. But we're in a much better position than we were in the past. And again, I just firmly believe that you've got to socialise in front of a government to get them to the point of agreeing to what you want.
I agree. I believe deeply in communities being the space of where you push like SDing climate change. But I also believe like when I came to Australia 10 years ago from Europe, I found it quite flabbergasting to find out that we're still in the debate of like, should we do anything about climate change? And now finally 10 years later, we are at that point where we're talking, yes, it's happening. What should we do? And now we need to get to the like, how fast can we do it and supported by communities. What would be your tips for people who have conversations on climate change with other people, like to motivate them to join? Like we're all about activating in particular people who have not yet been active in the climate movement. I find in our conversation, usually people come in and they have, as we said earlier, they've experienced what it means to live in a climate crisis. They're actually feeling deep fear inside. We know that 70% of Australians care about climate change, but only 23% or 22% of them actually have ever talked about it to someone else. Often in our conversations, like it happens over and over that people say, like, I've never known that you also cared and realize that they're not alone with their fear. So like, what are your tips for conversation on climate change with friends and family?
Yeah. I think we all struggle to talk to our friends and family about things that we find really scary because we don't want to scare others. But as you're saying, if we're feeling that fear, probably others in our network that probably have similar values to us and are reading the same sorts of materials are having those same fears. So I think it's a little bit of biting the bullet and, you know, raising those issues, particularly when you can in a conversation where you can be vulnerable. So often a one-on-one conversation to say, hey, I'm feeling really worried about this. Are you seeing that as well? And usually the other person will say, and they'll give you a pretty clear indication early on whether they're comfortable having that conversation. But even the act of raising it can feel somewhat empowering. Some people, you know, may need to raise it with a few different people to find that person. But there are also so many different groups now that you can engage with. So whether it's Parents for Climate Action, whether it's your group, whether it's bushfire survivors, Surfers for Climate Action, there's so many individual groups out there now that are catering to different audiences and have different memberships. So there is a community of like-minded people out there to connect with, which is really powerful.
That fits pretty much with what we do and how we communicate as well. And I think like especially the connecting with people afterwards and finding your community is like really important if you become an activist or get engaged in any way to like feel hope, because like being with like-minded people gives you hope. Thank you so much, Amanda, for your time.